Hey everyone, and welcome back to the final day of Sprout Sessions. I'm Sarah Nagel. I'm the Senior Manager of Brand Advocacy and Community here at Sprout Social, and I'm so excited to be able to introduce to you our CMO here, Scott Brandt, in just a minute to talk to you about what he's learned about the business impact of social as the CMO of a social company. We hope you've learned a lot so far this week, and while we're sad this is the last day, we hope that you've found plenty of takeaways to bring back to your organization that you're ready to implement. Don't forget to tune in this afternoon. We have Sprout All-Star Sarah Romero talking about integrating new social platform functionality into your strategy. So just a few housekeeping items before we start here with Scott. You can access any of the sessions from this week on our YouTube page. Please feel free to use the hashtag Sprout Sessions throughout this session to ask questions, to share your favorite bits of content, or simply just to follow along with the conversation. Know that you can also ask questions or leave comments in the chat panel just to the right of your YouTube screen there. And Scott will stick around for about 10 minutes after the presentation in order to answer all of your questions. So let's get this session started. Allow me to pass it over to our CMO, Scott Brandt, to introduce himself. Scott?
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Brandt, and as Sarah said, I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at Sprout Social. Before I get going, I certainly want to say thank you to Sarah, to Rachel, to Caitlin, and everybody who helped make sessions possible. We've heard from a lot of people that it's been a tremendous success, and as Sarah said, we hope you're getting great value from it. So thank you to my team. A little bit about me. I've been here for about 2.5 years now. Joined when the company was growing, and we continued to. Joined a great team, and really, really happy to be here. And what I'd like to do today is kind of tell you a little bit about myself and what I've learned so far, and some of the key takeaways, I think, really understanding social better than I ever have. So about me, like I said, I've been here 2.5 years. Prior to joining Sprout, I was at an online SaaS payroll company for about 8 or 9 years where we targeted small businesses heavily. And prior to that, going way back, I was actually with an online job board, monster.com, for a number of years with a number of their different companies. So I've been working in the SaaS space and the online space for upwards of 20 years now. And, you know, it's really, really changed since I've joined. Over the course of the career and early on, the online world really started as a push marketing platform where it just was another medium for brands and marketers to reach their audience. And it really allowed us to control the message. And, you know, it was just something to add to the mix of newspaper, TV, radio, etc. And I think as it's changed over time, and really some of the things that I've begun to learn a lot here at Sprout is just how the pendulum has begun to switch, where the brands used to control things, the consumers are really beginning to control things more than ever. If you take a look at it, content's driven by the consumer right now, where historically it was pushed by brands. Review sites now allow consumers and customers to really understand real experiences with products and services rather than having to read something that a brand put out. So really over time, I think the biggest switch that I've seen so far before I get going is that it really has turned the control over to consumers more than ever. And I think that's a great thing. And I think, you know, I'd like to cover some of the areas to point out where I think I can be helpful to everybody. So that's how I got here. Let's start with the evolution of social. You know, looking back to the beginning of social, it really was about connecting people. So if you go back to 1997, there was a website called 6 Degrees that allowed people to connect with one another. And as social began to get some legs underneath it, blogs began to kick in, where people began to talk and tell stories more than ever. And then back in 2006, both Facebook and Twitter entered the scene. So it really started as a way for people to connect with other people. As it's continued to evolve, and if you jump to today, in 2017, as of today, 9 in 10 companies are now active on social networks. What this basically means is they're leveraging the social networks to engage their consumers, followers, and communities. Where it used to be me talking to a friend or talking to a group of friends, it's now about me not only speaking to my friends, but talking to brands and the services and products that I buy regularly, and a way for me to engage them in a way that we never have been able to before this. You know, there's a statistic out there that suggests 80% of enterprise businesses today have a dedicated social media team. So it really speaks to the importance of social media And really, we're really in the nascent stages of it. It's just beginning, and it's going to be very interesting to see where this takes us over time. One thing that you do see is that brands understand that it is part of the brand experience. Your customers expect you to be on social media. That's where it used to be, I hope to find you. Now they expect to be able to talk to you and to see what you're up to. If you look back at a recent Sprouts social index that we conducted here, when customers talk to you on these social networks, they expect to hear back from you. Our study showed that they expect to hear back from you in hours, not days. And I think as we see the evolution of messaging begin to come into play, their expectations are only going to increase. And what this basically means to us brands is that we need to get back to these people quicker than ever because they're having a conversation with us and they need us to be there. So where does it really begin? I think it begins with an understanding that social media is an extension of your brand, and what you say and how you behave on social media reflects directly on your brand image and your perception. It really does. Most brands today do understand that the social networks engage them with their customers, and there's a lot to be gained from doing this. However, I think you need to be aware that consumers also take to social media to share negative stories, and we've certainly seen some examples of this recently. How you engage with your consumers online is how not only your consumers see you, but potential customers see you. So your perception starts there, and you really need to make sure that you're carrying forth the brand message that you stand by and that you stick to it. Pointing to two very easy examples recently was United Airlines' recent challenges, and they've had several of them, and also Uber. And I think if you get down to a lower level where if you looked at your Facebook or your Twitter or your Instagram accounts, you'd certainly see your friends and your connections talking about good and bad experiences frequently. And you need to be aware of this. So, my takeaway and what I'd share with everybody would be this. First, as with any marketing channel, you do need to understand where your markets are engaging. That's first and foremost. Where are they talking so I can listen to them, so I can engage with them? When I did some light research for this today, I saw that boomers and Gen X, 3 out of 4 of the boomers and Gen X generations like Facebook. You fast forward today where Gen Z, they prefer YouTube, Instagram, and Snap. So understanding who your target market is and understanding where your target market congregates online on the social networks is going to be key to your strategy. Secondly, once you understand where they're speaking, you really need to get back to understand how you want to engage in these social networks. So there's a few questions you really need to answer. When to engage. You're going to hear a lot of people talking about your brand, good and bad. You need to come up with a strategy about when. You need to understand how you're going to engage with them. You need to understand the voice and the tone for which you'll engage. It really is imperative that you understand this prior to launching into a social strategy, because you need to get this down, because one slip up really can cost you. So if, there are some different examples of brands we see where some are goofy, some are funny. And I'm going to lift something that I read in the Wall Street Journal this week, snarky. And what I mean by that is there was an article on Wendy's hamburgers this week on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And it really spoke to Wendy's strategy online. And they've taken the approach of being snarky, using their words, to their audience. And this means, giving them a hard time. It also means taking shots at competitors, which can or, may or may not be advantageous to a brand. But according to Wendy's, it's working for them. They're suggesting that their Twitter following is up 80% in a year, and that brand perception in their target market is up. So clearly, they thought of this strategy prior to taking the voice, and it seems to be working for them. My last piece of advice in this area is don't be afraid of negative feedback and don't run from negative posts. It's actually just the opposite. You really want to embrace these situations, because when you handle things with care and when you talk to your customers in a voice and look to resolve situations when there's been difficulties, it really shows everyone who's following you, your customers and your prospects and others, who you are. And it really builds a solid perception. So, in some cases, if it's so bad, you may choose not to engage, and that's part of the strategy. But I think in most cases, I'd suggest that you do engage and try to resolve the situation, because it'll reflect well on you and your brand. So moving on, second thing that I'd certainly call attention to that has been in the news and online all over the place is advocates. There's a statistic that suggests 74% of consumers identify word of mouth from a key influencer in their purchasing decision, meaning they go online and they find people who can influence them and they consider their opinion before making a purchase. The study was done by Ogilvy, Google, and TNS. So it really speaks to the fact that you can tap the potential online if you do things properly. So how do you do this? First, you need to identify who influencers can be. I think the easiest way to do this is to think about your customers. You know, customers are typically the best brand advocates for all of us. And when they love you, they'll tell people about you. You know, in doing some research, I found a post on Marketing Dive where they interviewed Sarah Ware of Markerly, and they conducted some research to understand if influencers with large followings were more impactful than influencers with smaller followings, or what I'd call customers or you know, typical people. According to the research, influencer size has a negative impact on engagement. So identifying influencers with smaller followings or customers closer to yours actually has a bigger impact for you and your brand, and it's more real. So it's a great takeaway that I would make sure I consider. 58% of consumers actively share their positive experiences with a company on social. So tapping this market is certainly going to be advantageous. You know, I asked the team here to come up with a good example, and they shared a really good one with me about who's doing this well. Maker's Mark Bourbon has an engaged brand ambassador community of more than 100,000 people. So ambassadorship is not just an extra marketing activity for them, but it's an essential part of their strategy. If you look at their Facebook page, for example, you'll see ambassadors regularly comment on their posts, share pictures and everything. And Maker's Mark involves their ambassadors on social media as much as possible, you know, as it not only allows them to reach a much deeper marketplace, but it's authentic. So they're really looking at their 100,000 ambassadors as brand advocates, helping spread their own message, influencing their followers. It's really a great strategy. So props to them for sure. Moving on, so some of the social impacts across the business. Social media, where before used to be about pushing lead gen, collateral, you know, moving into social where you're engaging as brands are today, it's much, much more than that. If you take a look at this slide, for example, these are just a few things that we highlighted where it can impact marketing, sales and lead gen, customer engagement, etc. So I wanted to share a few pieces on each of these to kind of give you an idea of what we mean. So according to NM Insight, 71% of customers who experience positive social care are likely to recommend the brand to others, compared to 19% of customers who don't get a response. So if I go out there and say something nice about you, and then you respond by saying thank you, even just something as little as that, 71% of these people are going to share it more than others would. And that's terrific. It speaks to reach. Twitter conducted a study, and they looked at airlines in particular, where they found that somebody who gets a positive experience online is likely to spend $9 more with that company. So $9 doesn't sound like a lot, but let's take a look at a terrific customer of ours, Monarch Airlines. They currently have an 8.8 out of 10 customer satisfaction rating on Twitter. They put customer experience at the center of their strategy, and it's really paying dividends as suggested by their rating. So if you think about it, they responded about 20,000, give or take, people online. Multiplying that by $9 for a quick ROI analysis, this suggests that just responding kindly generated about $180,000 in extra revenue for them, according to Twitter. So that's just a great stat there. But if we go on, you know, if you look at product research, for example, we at Sprout track customer feedback through numerous reports to pinpoint trends and topics of interest, and we share this with our product people so we can help build better products for our customers, and we think we are. Continuing, looking at recruiting. This is huge because building a solid team, and I can certainly speak from experience here, is critical to, you know, continuing a brand and really helping a company grow. So when similar to the way that we behave as a consumer, friends and family share jobs when they're available at their organizations. And there's a lot of research out there. Inc. shared that 79% of job seekers use social media during their job search. And there's some other research that I read that I just don't have the name of right now that suggests when people come into a company through a social connection, they're much more likely to stay, they're much more likely to be happy. And that just speaks to the power of the network again. Moving on, I think one of the most critical ones, and certainly this is a big part of our role here, sales and lead gen. According to HubSpot, leads generated on social media are 13% more likely to close than leads generated elsewhere, which is awesome. So I thought I'd throw very quickly a few tips if you're looking to get into social selling, and they're very quick and very easy. When I began, I said, make sure you understand where your target market is. This is certainly critical. As you begin to do some social selling, you certainly want to understand where your audience congregates. Be professional. In this case, it's the first impression, so consider that as you begin to reach out to these people. Leverage content, original content, really valuable, relevant content helps people, and it really allows them to reflect kindly on you and your brand, and certainly engage your audience. As you develop this relationship, awareness is built. As awareness is built and they go to research a purchase, whether it's tomorrow or a year from now, and they go to Google and type in what they're looking for and they know your brand name, much more likely to click. I would be remiss if I didn't mention some things I suggest not doing. Don't be generic. Social media is about one-to-one. Be authentic with your audience. Don't be too forward, meaning don't hound these people because it can be scary. So I think it's best to go about it lightly, be respectful of their time, and I think win them over time. And finally, this is my opinion, even though there's been different case studies where it can work, I'd suggest not being annoying, just because a lot of times when I'm on a Facebook doing something personal, I certainly don't want to be hounded by a brand. It actually might affect them negatively if they do it too often. So those are some very quick ideas that I had. So, those were the three things, and I went relatively quickly, but there's so much to talk about, but I think some of the ideas today could give you a good basis or help you continue your program as it's going. So a few of the takeaways just to remind you of: social is a customer experience, so you have to treat it as such. Make sure you're authentic to your brand. Be present and respond. If you're going to engage online, you can't go away. Your customers expect you to be there. So once you start, be there and be there quickly for them. As I said earlier, less push, more pull, meaning don't throw things at them. Don't throw promotions at them. Engage. This platform is so powerful and they'll love you for it. And finally, make sure that social is plugged in across your business. I gave several examples of the different departments that could capitalize on social media. So make sure as you do this, you really roll it out across the business and you'll be better for it. And there's certainly providers like us that would love to help you do it as you begin to take off with your social strategy. So those are the kind of things I wanted to cover today. I think, Sarah, I'm going to pass it back to you now, and if there's any questions, we'd love to take them.
Thanks so much, Scott. That was really great. It's always nice to get the perspective of someone of your position, for sure. So the first question we have here for you is, what do you think is the best way to communicate the value of social to other departments who, while we work here at a social media software company, other companies may not be as fortunate to have departments who understand the value of social. So what is your advice for a company in order to communicate that most effectively?
I think it's a great case, because certainly you have to be able to build up some momentum within an organization to get others to buy in. It's critical to making it successful. I think there's a few things you could do. You certainly could go online and take some experiences shared by others, meaning if there's a use case out there, if there's some other companies that are doing it well, especially big companies with big brand names, I would certainly take kindly to understanding how someone else might be doing something so we could build on it. That would certainly work well, and it has in the past. I think a second suggestion is, in marketing and in other areas, but especially in marketing, we test things. And I think because it's online and it can be immediate and fast, test something. There's little to lose. I think as long as you do that and you consider some of the things that I talked about earlier about making sure that when you begin testing and when you begin talking and engaging your audience, that you remain true to your brand, test it, see how it goes, and go from there and let the stats speak for how well it does for you. In my experiences, both here at Sprout and other organizations, and even my peers that I talk to, I think departments are continuing to learn just how powerful the medium is. So if at first you don't succeed, try again would certainly be my message in that case.
And kind of aligning with that, I'm curious how you allocate actual revenue to social impressions. While a lot of social media marketers go for kind of those more like softer metrics, how do you translate that as real business value?
Certainly. So, I think that's the most frequent question that I get. It certainly ties into ROI, and there's some great articles on our blog that I would suggest you can look up to read more about it. At times it's difficult. Certainly attribution in the online world, while it's becoming more and more of a science, at times it's difficult to measure. And what I mean by that is, if something's being talked about frequently online, there's companies out there like shoe companies and some other brands that have allowed and put campaigns directly into their social media where they're able to measure it. So they build the campaign, they use the social media to distribute the messaging, etc. Where measuring in that case is somewhat simple, and they're having success with it. In other cases, it is difficult, but I think it's also difficult to understand when we get insights from our customers on how to build a better product. It's difficult to come back and measure that, other than to believe in it. I recently met with a president of an online interactive agency, and it's taking a leap of faith. And I think with so many case studies out there right now and talking to so many of my peers, I think it's much less of a leap of faith that it really does work. I think you have to commit to it, and over time you'll see success in the different campaigns that are affected by social media. And I hope that answered, because I wish there were a much clearer answer, like a Google ad where you can measure clicks. Admittedly, attribution in some cases is pretty difficult.
Absolutely. Well, that's the challenge that all social media marketers face, right?
Yep.
I think that goes along though too with listening to that product feedback, and being keen on that kind of negative feedback too, so that you're getting a holistic kind of perspective from your audience there. So switching gears a little bit, we had a question from Roberto Tomasi from YouTube, and they asked, since public administrations and EU institutions are not businesses, is there something that you'd advise them to do on social media in order to achieve more engagement?
It's a great question. Because it's so niche, I don't want to suggest I know too much about this particular industry. But I was speaking with actually my cousin yesterday, who's the head of marketing at a company out in the western suburbs of Chicago. And it really does start with content, relevant content. Content's such a hot word, just like social media is, and it comes in so many forms. But in that way, in the public arena, it's certainly about helping your audience. That can mean so many things. It could mean educating them on statistics, helping them become smarter in your area of expertise that can lead to better decision making on their side. It can mean giving sage advice for something in the household. So I really believe that social media, in its essence, is engagement with and sharing of powerful content. Here at Sprout, we've got a terrific content department that builds all kinds of helpful pieces of content, whether it's helping with a specific social network or going much more deeply and much more sophisticated than that. But as we help people, we build credibility, and we begin to endear ourselves to them. And I would suggest the same thing in that incident.
And going along with that, what do you think is the best way to track that user over time? So as they're coming back to your site and getting more and more of this content, or back to your social media pages, how do you prove that that person has come back several times and found value and then eventually converts?
So, I think that this question can pivot into more of an internet marketing conversation, because to track an individual user by name is difficult. Now, you can, in some cases, understand if they engage with you and you get their name. Speaking from different experiences, not only here at Sprout but elsewhere, as you begin to get information from customers and they're willing to share it, most importantly, it does allow me at times to tie things back to that individual user. We actually look more at aggregate statistics in this case because following an individual user can be challenging, especially if they've never shared anything with you. So if I came in through, an incognito window, for example, you might never know, other than the tick of one user added, that it was me, Scott Brandt. So there's certainly some challenges with that. I think I would begin to pull back a little bit from an audience perspective, meaning if more and more people keep coming and sharing my content, that certainly suggests that I've written something powerful and helpful. If it's a customer that continually comes back, hopefully there's some technology in place within your organization that allows you to understand in particular who you're helping. I think the latter case, where it is a customer, is a little less creepy in some cases, and I think is beneficial because it allows us to produce more and better content that we know our customers like.
For sure. So speaking of statistics and tracking, we had a question from Crystal Kung from YouTube, and they asked, engagement is often very unevenly tracked across different social networks. Given that, how do you determine the ROI of each social network and whether you should be on it and active?
I think so when you throw ROI in that conversation, it gets a little more challenging because certainly it speaks to the resources put behind something and how much money you're investing in it to determine if the return's adequate or acceptable. I think I'd go back to my first comment, and this isn't to do with social media, but this is to do with everything marketing. You really need to understand who your audience is and where they are. For example, if you're heavily using Instagram as part of your social strategy, and you very infrequently get any engagement or anything from it, I think you begin to assess that maybe that's not the channel where your audience is. I think you can do the same thing in other networks where if Twitter, for example, generates lots of shares and a tremendous amount of engagement, I think that begins to speak to it. But ROI gets very tricky when you throw that in there to suggest that me spending time there is actually having a return on the business. I would be more inclined to try to understand my overall investment in the social effort and then try to understand the impact on the business and approach it from a top-down level before I got to any individual network. With that said, and I said this earlier, when you begin to engage or share on a network, you got to think that you're going to be in it for the long haul. Meaning, if you're not sure your audience is there and you're just starting your social strategy, it may behoove you to go slowly and focus on the networks that you know your audience is engaged on and start there, because it really can control the number of resources required internally that you'll put forth. And you can, I think, learn more about your audience over time and make more strategic moves.
Absolutely. It's definitely about knowing the audience. But we had another question from Crystal. They asked if you had any interesting statistics to share about the best ways or times to use various social networks. I know that you said it's really specific to each brand, but is it always? Do you have any kind of general best practices for that?
I couldn't recite them off the top of my mind. I know I've read things about rolling up to an like, for example, an industry at an aggregate number. I would just add this. I think it's a great place to start, and I speak from experience here, where understanding best practice is always a good idea, but it doesn't necessarily reflect on your brand and the way your customers behave. So I know that you said, is there some general information that you could use to begin? I think if you did some research, you might find some, but I would certainly implore you to test and to measure, because we certainly have the ability in our analytics platform here at Sprout to share that information with you when people engage in your different platforms. It's worth it to understand that. A lot of times you'll find that you may do things better than quote unquote industry best practice because there's an average in that number. So I think it's a decent place to start. I think it's an okay thing to consider, but certainly go back to your customer and your own information to make any strategic decisions about when to engage.
That's great advice, Scott. So it looks like we have time for just one more question, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit for this one. Can you share a time that you've seen social expertly incorporated across different departments, whether at a previous job or at a company that you've worked with?
I've honestly, we've seen several, especially some of our customers. Um, I think those that come to mind without, maybe naming any to exclude any. I think there's several out there. I think I'd go broader to kind of answer the question, because I think, and I know we have use cases, for example, in our blog that we can share that talks about different companies that I think do it very well. And there's a number of them. I think it's more about that. And it's funny, we end on the question that where we started with, Sarah, about, how to get social integrated throughout a business strategy. Um, I think it really depends on the need and the acceptance of social to do it well. There are big brands out there that I think do it extraordinarily well. I don't. I don't know that one sticks out more than some others, because I'd hate to do that. Um, but I think the point that I'd make is, I would point that person who asked the question to our blog. I think there's terrific use cases and stories told by brands that can help and give insights in that way.
Very cool. Great tip there, Scott. So it looks like we're out of time for today. Thank you, Scott, so much for your insights here. This was super helpful. I think a lot of people found a lot of value out of getting your perspective as the CMO here at Sprout. So thank you, everyone, for listening here. As you probably know, we're going to be compiling the major takeaways from this session, and we'll be sharing it with all of you afterwards. You can keep the conversation going, though, on social media using the hashtag #SproutSessions. And from all of us at Sprout, have a great summer.